beyond the last inhabited coast, the sea no longer behaves like an open road. Ice closes across the water in plates, ridges, and dark seams. A three-masted wooden ship stands among them with her sails quiet and her engine no longer driving ahead. The name on her stern is Fram, meaning forward, although on this winter night she appears almost motionless. Her masts rise into the polar darkness, while the hull rests inside a field that moves too slowly for the eye to follow. Fram had left Norway in the summer of 1893 and followed the northern edge of Eurasia until pack ice began to close around her in September. The voyage was not interrupted there. It changed form. Sails were quieted, the engine no longer drove ahead, and the crew prepared to remain where other ships would have searched for escape. By early 1894, the last coast was far behind. Beyond the rail lay no harbor light or returning lane. Only snow, pressure ridges, and the slow road the ice was making for them. This evening belongs to the first winter of the expedition rather than to one perfectly preserved date. Nansen's published journal records meals, watches, scientific measurements, books, music, dogs, repairs, cold, aurora, and the changing pressure of the pack. Those details allow a representative night to take shape without assigning every sound and gesture to the same hour. The result is not a lost diary entry reconstructed word for word, but the ordinary rhythm of a documented community living inside the Arctic night. The darkness around Fram was not empty of earlier knowledge. Nansen had studied northern clothing, skis, dogs, travel, and survival practices developed across Arctic communities long before his expedition began. Laboratory instruments and industrial supplies came aboard in Europe, but successful movement through snow and cold also depended on methods learned from people already adapted to those conditions. The voyage entered an incompletely mapped ocean, not an uninhabited world without memory. The ship's stillness creates a powerful illusion. Snow gathers around the hull, tracks remain visible longer than they would on a working harbor, and the masts appear fixed to the sky. Yet the flow is already carrying everyone away from the point where they entered it. The absence of visible speed does not mean the voyage has stopped. It means that movement has passed from machinery into ice, current, and time. The plan began with a small piece of evidence carried an immense distance. Wreckage from the American expedition ship Jeanette, crushed near the New Siberian Islands in 1881, later appeared near Greenland. Norwegian meteorologist Henrik Mohn argued that a current might cross the Arctic from the Siberian side toward the Atlantic. Nansen saw in that drifting debris not a route that could be steered, but a movement that might be entered. He proposed placing a specially built ship inside the pack and allowing the ice to carry it for as long as the crossing required. The idea reversed ordinary seamanship. Fram would give up the quick reassurance of a wake, a working rudder, and an open line of retreat. Safety would come instead from the rounded hull, years of provisions, disciplined routines, and confidence in a current that no one aboard could see or feel directly. When the ice finally held the ship, the change could be heard in the absence of familiar motion. Water no longer hurried along the planks. The engine settled into silence. A gloved hand on the rail felt only cold timber and the faint responses of the flow. Nansen described the current as their new motive power and Fram as a barrack for scientific work. Below deck, that large idea became smaller things: watches, meals, lamps, notebooks, drying clothes, and doors carefully closed against the night. There's something unusually quiet in this method of discovery. Distance accumulates without a wake behind the stern. A position measured today may be north of yesterday's, or disappointingly south, even though no sail has been altered. The drift can pause, reverse, or curve through an unseen eddy. Every calculation, therefore, joins patience to uncertainty. The expedition has placed itself inside a natural system whose scale cannot be hurried, and the first skill required is to live well while the answer arrives. Patience acquired a physical form aboard Fram. It was fuel left unburned, a watch completed even when the position disappointed, a wet glove placed to dry rather than forgotten near the door. The crew had chosen a method that could not be forced to reveal its answer. Their task was not to remain heroic at every hour, but to keep the ship, the instruments, the dogs, and one another ready, while the invisible road slowly declared itself. Fram was designed by the shipbuilder Colin Archer in close cooperation with Nansen. Speed was not the ruling priority. The vessel had to be small enough to handle among flows, broad enough to carry years of supplies, and strong enough to survive pressure from every side. Her hull was short, wide, and rounded, with few projecting edges for the ice to seize. Bow, stern, and keel were shaped so that converging flows would tend to lift the ship rather than hold and crush her. The structure beneath the cabins was dense with timber and iron. Heavy beams were tied together until the hull behaved less like a light shell and more like a single wooden mass. The stem contained multiple oak beams, and the cross bracing extended through the ship rather than strengthening only one vulnerable area. On deck, Fram measured about 128 feet from stem to stern, while her great width gave the hull the compact, almost bowl-like form that made the design appear strange to many sailors. Warmth was treated as part of the ship's strength. The saloon and sleeping cabins were wrapped in layers of felt, cork, wood, reindeer hair stuffing, linoleum, trapped air, and thick deck planking. Cold surfaces were isolated from damp interior air so that moisture would not freeze into the berths. Even the skylight used several panes of glass. The people inside the ship were not protected by one wall, but by repeated boundaries, slowing the movement of heat from the center toward the Arctic outside. The Fram preserved in Oslo today is the real ship, but she does not display the first expedition exactly as she appeared in 1894. After Nansen's voyage, an extra deck and additional cabins were added for Otto Sverdrup's second expedition, and the vessel was later restored primarily to that later form. The first winter must therefore be visualized through the surviving hull together with original plans, photographs, and Nansen's description. The ship is authentic. The correct date still requires historical discipline. A ship shaped to rise under pressure might look awkward in ordinary water, and Fram was never intended to win admiration through speed. Her unusual proportions made the design visible even from a distance. The broad hull, rounded bottom, and heavy timbers announced that this vessel had been optimized for one narrow purpose. Beauty followed function here. The ship was graceful because every line answered a specific danger. In late September 1893, ice gathered around Fram north of the Siberian coast. Slush hardened between floes, open water narrowed, and the crew understood that the ship was being enclosed. This was not an accident, interrupting the voyage. It was the moment for which the vessel had been built. Coal was shifted, stores were arranged, equipment was secured, and spaces designed for travel were reorganized for a residence that might last several winters. The border between voyage and settlement disappeared beneath new ice. A sailing ship normally proves herself through movement. Water passing along the hull, pressure in canvas, response at the rudder. Fram's first winter reversed those signs. The propeller and rudder could be withdrawn into protected wells. The engine room remained a place of machinery, maintenance, and stored potential rather than continuous propulsion. Rigging still needed inspection, but the sails above the deck no longer carried the expedition through open sea. The moving part of the vessel had become the world surrounding it. As snow collected, the deck and hull entered the shape of the flow. Paths were marked across the ice. Scientific instruments stood at measured distances from the metal and timber of the ship. Dogs occupied the deck and later the frozen ground nearby. Hummocks rose where floes had pressed together, and level areas formed temporary streets extending into darkness. Fram was no longer merely surrounded by landscape. She had become the central building in a small settlement made of wood, snow, canvas, instruments, and animal tracks. The transformation altered the meaning of indoors. A door no longer opened onto a harbor or a moving deck above waves. It opened onto a fixed-looking field that could crack, fold, and drift for hundreds of miles. The gangway became a threshold between two kinds of time: the measured schedule of meals and watches below, and the slow, irregular motion of the Arctic above. Each return through the door carried frost on clothing and new information about the ice, even when nothing visible seemed to have changed. The new settlement on the floe had no permanent boundary. A safe path today could be broken tomorrow by a lead of open water or a newly raised pressure ridge. Equipment placed outside had to be checked after movement. Distance from the ship could change in meaning even when it remained the same in yards. The crew learned the local geography repeatedly because the ground itself revised the map around their home. 13 men formed the expedition. Nansen directed the scientific program, while Otto Sverdrup captained Fram. Sigurd Scott Hansen managed meteorological, astronomical, and magnetic observations. Henrik Blessing served as doctor and botanist. Engineers cared for the machinery. Sailors handled the ship and ice work. Adolf Jewell managed cooking and stores. Bernhard Nordal watched over the dynamo and electrical installation. The crew was small because every additional person required years of food, space, heat, and trust. Several men carried skills beyond their official titles. A sailor might assist with observations. A stoker could become an accomplished dog driver. A machinist could forge an instrument or repair a household object. The doctor studied algae and eventually treated dogs because the crew gave him too few human patients. This overlap mattered in a place without outside services. Fram could not send a broken part ashore, call another watch, or replace a specialist. Knowledge had to circulate through the same narrow rooms as conversation. Life aboard was hierarchical, but isolation made cooperation immediate. Sverdrup's authority as captain did not remove him from shared meals, games, walks, or the sound of work in neighboring cabins. The scientific results depended on night watches taken by different men, and the galley routine required each person to assist in turn. One person's carelessness could waste fuel, damage an instrument, or endanger a dog. One person's competence could make the ship warmer, brighter, cleaner, or easier to live in. The expedition is often remembered through two famous names, Nansen and Fram, yet the winter was sustained by a whole company. A position could not be calculated without observations. An observation could not be taken without someone facing the cold, and the observer could not continue without food, dry clothing, repaired equipment, and another person keeping watch. Heroism on this night is distributed across ordinary duties. The ship remains habitable because 13 people repeatedly complete small tasks before those tasks become emergencies. The small company carried several forms of memory. Some men had sailed Arctic waters before, some knew naval machinery, and others brought science, medicine, cooking, hunting, or workshop experience. Their combined knowledge did not eliminate mistakes, but it reduced the number of problems that had only one possible solver. On a long expedition, redundancy existed not only in spare parts. It existed in people willing to learn one another's work. The living quarters lay beneath the raised afterdeck. At their center was the saloon, serving as dining room, common room, reading room, and evening gathering place. Sleeping cabins surrounded it on all sides, adding another protective layer between shared warmth and the outer hull. 4 cabins contained 1 berth each, while 2 larger cabins held 4 berths. The arrangement gave privacy only in limited measure, but it placed the warmest social space at the center of the ship. 2 companionways led from the galley area toward the deck. Each was fitted with 4 small insulated doors, and the thresholds were unusually high. Going outside required passing through a sequence rather than opening one direct gap into the cold. A person carried a lamp or felt along timber, closed one door before opening the next, and gradually entered the outer air. The architecture turned every departure into a controlled exchange, preserving heat through habit as much as through material. Nansen recorded that Fram remained surprisingly warm and dry. At times the men sat comfortably with only a lamp burning, even while the temperature outside was far below freezing. An air sail directed cold air into the ventilation system, yet the layered insulation held interior heat. Damp appeared in a few places but did not transform mattresses and walls into the masses of ice known from less carefully designed polar ships. Comfort here was not luxury. It was successful engineering protecting sleep, health, and attention. The warmth was also human. Wet gloves were set where they could dry. A coat removed near the doorway stopped carrying cold toward the table. A berth received the heat of a body and the quiet movement of someone reading before sleep. The saloon's central position gathered lamps, food, speech, and breath, while the surrounding cabins softened the Arctic at the walls. Outside, the pack extended beyond sight. Inside, distance was reduced to the length of a table and the sound of a page turning. The cabin arrangement also influenced sound. A cough, a drawer, a conversation in the saloon, or a boot passing toward the companionway traveled easily through timber. Privacy was created by courtesy more than distance. Men learned when to speak quietly, where smoking belonged, and how late games could continue before disturbing others. The ship's social insulation was as necessary as the felt and cork inside the walls. Fram carried an electrical installation, an unusual advantage for a polar expedition of the period. While the engine was running, it could drive the dynamo. During the drift, a windmill raised on the foredeck supplied power when the air moved strongly enough. The apparatus took weeks to arrange, and its sails required care in hard weather. Once it worked, the ship could convert the same Arctic wind that chilled the rigging into light below deck. Electric lamps changed the saloon more than their practical brightness alone would suggest. Nansen noticed an immediate improvement in spirits when the room was illuminated clearly. Cards could be distinguished, faces separated from shadow, and the long night briefly divided from itself. Yet, electricity was intermittent. Calm weather or mechanical interruption returned the ship to petroleum lamps, and those smaller flames remained essential for cabins, work, cooking, and warmth. Fram's night was therefore layered, not uniformly bright. The strongest visual contrast belongs at the skylight. When the dynamo was working, light from the saloon could reach outward onto the surrounding snow while the windmill turned above. The effect did not resemble a modern vessel filled with electric glare. Most of the ship remained dark timber, narrow passages, shaded berths, and isolated practical lamps. The electric system made selected spaces more usable without erasing the night. Darkness continued to hold the deck, rigging, and immeasurable field beyond. Power had to be watched like any other provision. Nordahl understood the dynamo, accumulators, wiring, and lamps, while others helped manage the windmill and its sails. Too much wind could damage the mechanism. Too little produced no current. The system linked weather to mood in an intimate way. A stronger breeze might mean harder cold on deck, but better light in the saloon. The men did not command the night. They negotiated with it, converting a limited part of its energy into a few hours of clarity. When the windmill stopped, the change could be heard before it was seen. Its mechanical rhythm faded above the deck, and the supply of electrical light became finite again. The accumulators held what the wind had already given, but not without limit. This made brightness feel temporary and valuable. A lamp extinguished in an unused space returned stored energy to the hours when reading, calculation, or medical work required it most. Without the sun, time survived in chronometers, watches, meals, and duties. Meteorological observations were taken every 4 hours, and during some periods every 2. The night observer left the common warmth in boots and layered clothing, passed through the insulated doors, and stepped into air that met the face immediately. A lamp, a gloved hand, and a small set of instruments were enough to continue the schedule while most of the ship slept. When weather allowed, Scott Hansen and an assistant determined the expedition's position from astronomical observations. The work began outside with cold metal, darkness, and breath briefly visible near the instrument. It ended inside with paper, angles, times, and arithmetic beneath a lamp. Men waited near his cabin for the result. A few minutes north could lighten the table. A drift south could quiet it. With no landmark beyond the hull, numbers became the track beneath the ship. Magnetic instruments had to stand away from Fram's iron, first in a tent on the floe and later in a snow hut. Aurora observations received their own journal. Thermometers, barometers, hygrometers, anemometers, chronometers, and self-registering devices continued to mark changes beyond ordinary feeling. Frost gathered on fittings. Fabric stiffened near an outer door. Back in the saloon, a pencil moved across the page while the instrument extended human senses into the dark. The schedule gave the darkness edges. Breakfast came at 8, dinner at 1, supper at 6, and watch changes divided the remaining hours. A card game could continue late, but the stars would not wait for an observer. The ship's clock did not make the outside world less vast. It made responsibility possible within it. Every completed entry declared that time was still passing, even when the horizon offered no sunrise, and the ship appeared unchanged from 1 hour to the next. Accuracy depended less on inspiration than on return. One reading might be mistaken. A long series could reveal pattern. One position might contain observational error. Repeated calculations traced the drift. The value of the night watch therefore exceeded the discomfort of its hour. Cold fingers wrote a figure. The notebook closed. Boots crossed the threshold again, and warmth slowly returned through gloves and sleeves. Much later, that small entry would stand beside thousands of others and help describe the motion of an ocean. Beneath the timber floor lay another darkness. The expedition had come to measure an ocean whose depth, temperature, salinity, currents, and living organisms were poorly known to European science. A sounding line passed from gloved hands through an opening in the ice, while a pulley answered with a small wooden or metallic complaint. The line descended far beyond the reach of the lamp, making the hidden water below feel deeper with every length paid out. Water bottles and thermometers were lowered to different depths, then brought back into the limited circle of work. Nets and dredges collected tiny animals, plants, mud, and other material. Under a lamp, labels had to remain legible. Vessels had to be handled carefully, and cold, wet equipment had to be cleaned before it stiffened. Newly formed ice could hold swarms of microscopic organisms. The polar sea appeared empty from the mast, yet life and motion continued at scales the eye could not follow. The measurements gradually showed that the central Arctic was a deep ocean, rather than a shallow sea surrounding a large, undiscovered continent. That conclusion belongs to the expedition's long scientific legacy, not to a single evening. On board, knowledge arrived as repeated physical work. Lower the line, wait, feel the change in tension, raise it again, read, warm the fingers, label the sample, and begin once more. The unknown became smaller without ever becoming dramatic. At night the ocean is present without being visible. A person seated at the saloon table may be only a few feet above the waterline, yet the sounding line has shown great depth below the hull. The ice seems like ground, the ship seems like a building, and still an ocean moves under both. This hidden vertical distance gives Fram's home an unusual foundation. The crew lives on a floor that drifts over water, while their instruments reach downward into darkness beneath darkness. Soundings also corrected practical expectations. The seabed did not rise where some theories had placed it, and water from different depths did not behave as one uniform body. Later oceanographers would carry these observations much further. During the drift, however, Each result first existed as line coiled on deck, moisture on a glove, a thermometer protected from a careless touch, and another entry drying beside the lamp. Science remained inseparable from the hands that kept it accurate. Daily life required fresh water, and the frozen sea could not be melted without selection. Salt remained trapped in much of the sea ice, especially when newly formed. The crew searched for good freshwater ice, carried it to the galley, and melted it for cooking, drinking, and washing. What appeared to be an unlimited white landscape, therefore, demanded knowledge. One piece of ice could supply a kettle. Another could leave an unpleasant concentration of salt. Stores filled the holds in carefully packed layers. Fram carried provisions for more than 5 years because the duration of the drift could not be known in advance. Bread, vegetables, and other foods vulnerable to damp were sealed in tins. The menu was deliberately varied to reduce the danger of scurvy and to preserve appetite through monotony. Coal, petroleum, clothing, dog food, scientific equipment, tools, boats, and spare parts turned the ship into a compressed warehouse for several possible futures. Every object taken from storage became an accounting decision. A tin opened today could not be replaced until the expedition returned to inhabited waters. Fuel used for one purpose was no longer available for another. At the same time, excessive restriction could weaken health and morale. The crew lived between abundance and distance. The holds were full, but the nearest shop lay beyond an ocean of ice. Good management meant allowing ordinary comfort while remembering the years that might remain. Near evening, a block of selected ice softens inside a metal vessel. Drops gather, then a shallow pool, then enough water for tea or washing. The process is quiet and domestic, but it links the saloon directly to the frozen world outside. No pipe brings water through the wall. Someone has walked onto the floe, judged the ice, lifted it, and carried it back through the doors. The cup on the table contains a small piece of the landscape made temporarily warm. Water also linked cleanliness to fuel. Ice might be freely available outside, but melting it required heat, vessels, time, and labor. A bath or large washing, therefore, carried a real cost without becoming impossible. The crew's comfort came from planning these exchanges rather than pretending resources were limitless. Even in a landscape made almost entirely of frozen water, a worn basin remained a manufactured object. The ship's day began with breakfast at 8. Nansen described hard rye and wheat bread, several kinds of cheese, preserved meat or fish, biscuits, marmalade, tea, coffee, or chocolate. Fresh bread was baked several times a week, and cake appeared often enough to become part of the expedition's ordinary comfort. The exact plate changed, but the principle remained steady. Regular meals, recognizable flavors, and enough variety to keep food from becoming another form of darkness. After breakfast, each man turned toward his work. One crew member served a weekly turn assisting in the galley, helping the cook wash, lay the table, and wait on the others. Dinner at 1 often included several courses. Supper came at 6, when the regulated working day ended. The schedule did not eliminate scientific watches or sudden tasks, but it repeatedly gathered the company in one place. Food gave the expedition a shared beginning, middle, and close. The galley had another social function. Smoking was generally kept out of the cabins, so after meals the smokers gathered near the kitchen, where warmth, tobacco, stories, and arguments mixed in a smaller space. The saloon, meanwhile, could become quiet for reading. These arrangements prevented one activity from occupying every room. Even on a ship only 128 feet long, the men created different atmospheres: work, smoke, rest, conversation, and silence. Supper on this representative night is not a feast and does not need an invented menu. Cups are filled, preserved food is divided, and the table bears the marks of long use. Outside, the temperature may be severe. Inside, The meal remains ordinary enough for someone to think about tomorrow's task, while another finishes a story. The success of the galley lies precisely in that ordinariness. Far from any farm or market, the crew can still sit down at an expected hour and recognize the shape of home. Meals preserved social equality without erasing role. The captain, scientist, engineer, sailor, and cook met around the same table, though their duties differed. Praise and complaint circulated quickly, because everyone experienced the result of the galley's work. A successful loaf improved the day for all 13. A wasted ingredient belonged to all 13 as well. The table transformed provisions into community. Dogs were essential to the expedition's plans beyond the ship. Animals were obtained in Siberia and brought aboard for hauling sledges over the ice. During the winter, they occupied the deck and, later, areas on the floe. Their presence changed the sound and movement of Fram. Chains shifted, paws struck timber or snow, and a chorus of impatience could rise when feeding or release approached. The ship carried not only a human community, but a demanding animal one. Morning care followed a routine. Dogs were fed dried fish or biscuits, released for movement, inspected and managed according to their health and behavior. Training journeys tested harnesses, sledges, snow conditions, and the experience of the drivers. Nansen learned that dog driving required patience long before it became central to his later journey north. Every apparently simple run across the floe depended on traces, weight, discipline, and animals willing to pull together. The dogs also drew human attention outward. Their barking could signal movement in the darkness long before a person saw anything. After predators approached the ship, night watches became more attentive to the animals on the ice. A lantern might pass along the rail, and a watcher might listen across hummocks without leaving the safety of the marked path. Vigilance did not always lead to a hunt. The animal senses extended the boundary of the ship. As the evening settles, most of the dogs become quieter. One turns in the snow, another tests its chain, and another lifts its head toward a sound too faint for the saloon below. Their bodies are adapted to a cold that requires layers of clothing and doors for the humans. Yet the animals also depend on the crew for food, order, treatment, and protection. On the floe, exploration is a partnership between species, maintained through repetitive care rather than romantic wilderness alone. The animals introduced another timescale to the expedition. They needed care regardless of whether scientific results were encouraging or the crew felt tired. Feeding, exercise, injury, breeding, and discipline continued according to bodily need rather than the map. This dependable demand could be burdensome, but it also prevented the ship from becoming entirely absorbed in abstract latitude. The dogs kept part of life immediate. Waiting did not mean idleness. Fram's rigging, windmill, engine, pumps, boats, sledges, instruments, lamps, and domestic fittings required inspection and repair. Provisions had to be moved from the hold. Sails and ropes were checked. A forge could throw red light onto rime-covered rigging, while the turning lathe and benches inside supported smaller work. The expedition had carried a workshop because a broken object in the Arctic could not remain merely inconvenient. The men made and altered equipment as experience demanded. Sails were prepared for boats and hand sledges. Knives, axes, wooden footwear, nails, and specialized tools emerged from the same limited stock of material. A design that looked adequate in Norway might reveal a weakness after weeks on pressure ridges. Repair therefore became a form of continuing research. Each modified object contained information gained from cold fingers, uneven ice, and repeated use. Even recreation entered the workshop. When damp and wear damaged the cardboard music plates of the mechanical organ, Nansen experimented with making a replacement from zinc. A small project joined engineering to morale. A sheet of metal, marked correctly, could return familiar music to the saloon. The distinction between essential and unnecessary work blurred in isolation. A pump protected the ship. A repaired instrument protected the livability of the people inside it. At night, the workbench holds evidence of unfinished thought. Filings, cord, a tool set down beside a measured piece, perhaps a lamp shading the nearest hands. The vessel around it is itself the largest repaired object, always being checked against ice and time. Nothing aboard is entirely passive. Wood swells, metal contracts, leather stiffens, oil thickens, and fabric wears. The workshop keeps these changes from accumulating beyond control, one adjustment at a time. Improvisation was safest when it rested on good preparation. Fram carried spare materials, tools, boats, pumps, and redundant parts, because invention alone could not replace missing resources. The workshop did not create everything from nothing. It extended the usefulness of what had been selected in Norway. Each repair connected foresight before departure with judgment acquired on the ice. A well-stocked library had been treated as essential equipment. After supper, the saloon often became a reading room, with men seated around the table or lying in their berths with books. Publishers and friends had supplied literature, illustrations, and reference works in quantities large enough to make reading part of the daily routine. A book could occupy the same physical space for hours, while carrying the reader across countries, cities, families, and seasons absent from the Arctic. Cards and other games appeared later in the evening. The organ could be turned by a crank. Johansen played the accordion, and Mogstad also contributed music. Waltzes, songs, and familiar melodies changed the saloon without changing its walls. Nansen described the renewed sound of the organ as a comfort when repaired plates made music possible again. Entertainment was not a denial of the expedition's purpose. It was part of the system that kept 13 people capable of continuing it. The crew also produced a newspaper called Fram. Its jokes, notices, verses, and affectionate mockery were read aloud, turning the expedition into its own tiny public. On a ship without incoming mail, printed news, or telegraph contact, the men created local news from one another. Humor gave ordinary habits a different shape and allowed authority, boredom, mistakes, and personality to be handled without every tension becoming serious. Not every reader was free from homesickness, and not every song erased uncertainty. Photographs, letters carried from Norway, and remembered voices could make distance more visible. The value of the evening routine lay not in constant cheerfulness, but in its ability to contain several moods at once. One person reads silently, another repairs a game counter, another listens, and another thinks of home. The saloon remains shared without demanding that every mind occupy the same place. Framsia also preserved the crew's ability to observe themselves. The newspaper turned repeated habits into stories and exaggerated small flaws until they became comic rather than irritating. In a closed community, that distance mattered. Laughter allowed the men to recognize monotony without being defeated by it. The same saloon that served scientific discussion could briefly become a theater, newsroom, or concert room. Henrik Blessing had prepared to serve as the expedition's doctor, yet the crew remained remarkably healthy during the drift. The men generally gained weight rather than wasting away, and Blessing sometimes found more medical work among the dogs than among his companions. This outcome was not proof that the Arctic had become harmless. It reflected careful food planning, dry quarters, regular habits, physical work, and the selection of healthy crew members before departure. Once a month, the doctor weighed each man and examined blood measures associated with red cells and hemoglobin. The procedure interested everyone because scurvy remained a feared possibility on long polar voyages. Numbers allowed the crew to look for changes before serious illness appeared. Health was treated as another field of observation, joining weather, magnetism, ice, and ocean. The expedition studied the effect of the environment on the human body while living inside that effect. Cleanliness required effort but did not disappear. Freshwater ice was melted for washing, and Nansen recorded taking a bath in a tin tub in the galley. Clothing could be aired, dried, repaired, and adjusted to work outside. Walks and skiing provided exercise across the floe. The crew did not maintain modern standards of privacy or convenience, yet small acts of washing and grooming could restore a sense of ordinary personhood within a world of heavy garments and cold surfaces. Before sleep, health becomes less measurable. A stiff shoulder eases near warmth. A cold face returns to normal color. Dry socks matter more than heroic language. Someone settles into a berth with a book, while the doctor's instruments remain unused until the next scheduled check. The ship's medical success is visible not in a dramatic cure, but in the absence of crisis. Breathing remains steady, appetite continues, and the night can be given to rest. Mental health did not appear in the expedition's records through modern diagnostic language, yet the attention given to light, routine, reading, music, exercise, food, and humor is difficult to ignore. These practices were not formal therapy, but they reduced the pressure of confinement and darkness. The crew cared for morale through the structure of daily life, often before distress could become a medical problem. Pack ice is rarely silent for long. Floes expand, contract, turn, and press against one another as wind and current change. The sound can begin at a distance as a low grinding, then approach in cracks, groans, knocks, and a roar compared by Nansen to a waterfall. Inside the saloon, conversation may pause while the noise passes along the hull. The ship can tremble or lift slightly, not because she is sailing, but because the surface supporting her is rearranging itself. Fram had been built for this pressure. Her rounded sides offered the ice little hold, and the force tending to squeeze the hull also encouraged it upward. During the first winter, the design repeatedly turned frightening sound into manageable movement. This does not make every pressure event harmless, and a more serious crisis would come in January 1895. The representative night remains within the earlier winter, where vigilance is real but abandonment is not underway. A person stepping onto the deck sees little of the process. The darkness hides the full ridge, leaving noise to reveal scale. A lantern illuminates rail, rope, snow, and perhaps the nearest broken edge. Beyond that small circle, blocks are rising like frozen waves. An aurora may remain quiet above the disturbance, separating the rapid motion of light from the heavy motion of ice. The Arctic does not need a storm to make the ship feel small. Eventually the pressure weakens. Shocks become farther apart, the roar withdraws, and timber returns to its ordinary creaks. Someone checks the deck, instruments, dogs, and marked paths. The saloon conversation resumes at a lower volume. Fram has not defeated the ice, she has responded as designed. The night becomes calm again because wood, geometry, preparation, and watchfulness have absorbed the event without allowing it to govern every remaining hour. The sound of pressure could also test memory. Each man knew why the hull had been rounded and strengthened, but knowledge on paper felt different when the ice roared against the ship. Confidence had to be renewed by experience. Every event the vessel survived made the design less theoretical. The creak of timber became evidence that the ship was responding, not merely suffering. The expedition's position changed slowly, and not always in the desired direction. During the autumn of 1893, the drift sometimes carried Fram south, challenging Nansen's expectations. By January 1894, northerly movement became more encouraging, and on the 2nd of February, the ship had passed 80 degrees north. The occasion was celebrated, but the number did not prove that Fram would reach the pole. At the rate observed, the journey could still require years. Position calculations shaped hope because the horizon offered no landmark. Men waited outside Scott Hansen's cabin for the result of an observation. A few minutes north brought relief. Movement south created disappointment. The repeated reversals revealed the psychological difficulty of passive travel. The expedition had chosen to trust the current, yet trust had to survive evidence that seemed for days or weeks to oppose the plan. The map in the saloon contained coastlines, islands, estimated depths, routes of earlier expeditions, and a large central uncertainty. Fram's measurements slowly replaced some of that uncertainty with positions and water data. No new inhabited shore appeared during this winter, and no hidden continent rose beyond the hummocks. The discovery was more subtle, an ice-covered ocean of great depth, moving through a system larger than any one expedition could observe directly. By late winter, a faint southern twilight began to alter the ship. Daylight would eventually reach the saloon again, first as a weak dilution of darkness, and then with growing confidence. On this representative night, however, lamps still define the rooms. The map remains open beneath their limited light, and the next position has not yet been written. Outside, the ice offers no preview of the years ahead. It carries Fram onward one unannounced distance at a time. The approach of twilight did not end uncertainty. More light improved work and mood, but it also revealed the roughness of the surrounding ice and the enormous distance still to travel. Winter had not carried Fram over the pole, and the current remained slower and less direct than hoped. The growing day therefore brought information rather than simple reassurance. Discovery continued to include disappointment. Late at night, the common room empties gradually. A book closes. Cards are gathered. A lamp is lowered, while another remains for the watch. Through the insulated doors, someone goes on deck to read an instrument or look toward the dogs. The air sail turns toward the wind, sending cold air through the ventilator without emptying the warmth from the cabins. Below, berths receive the people who will be needed again at the next meal, observation, repair, or watch. Fram appears still, yet the entire scene is moving. The saloon table, engine, library, provisions, dogs, snow hut, pressure ridges, and footprints all travel together inside the pack. No person aboard can feel the current directly. Its work becomes visible only through astronomical position and the changing relation of ice. The expedition's greatest movement is therefore silent and shared. The ship does not pass through the landscape. For a time, the landscape carries the ship. The expedition would continue for more than 3 years. Nansen and Hjalmar Johansen would later leave the ship by dog sledge, while Fridtjof and the remaining crew continued the drift. Fram would emerge from the ice in 1896, and every member of the expedition would return safely. Its measurements would change European understanding of the Arctic Ocean. On this night, none of those outcomes is available yet. There is only the latest entry, the next watch, and a ship prepared to remain. Nothing more is asked from the darkness now. A cup has cooled on the table. A glove hangs near the companionway, and the last open notebook is closed beneath the lamp. The instruments have been read, the dogs have settled, and the hull remains warm enough at its center. Far below, deep water moves under the ice. Far above, rigging stands against a sky without sunrise. Between them rests a wooden ship built to yield without giving way. Sleep aboard Fram is not complete silence. Timber adjusts. A lamp gives a faint hiss. Fabric shifts beside a berth, and a distant dog answers once across the floe. These are the sounds of a functioning home, not an emergency. Breathing steadies behind the cabin doors, while the latest position waits in its notebook. Beyond the hull, the ice keeps its invisible road. Fram goes with it, warm at the center, dark at the edges, and almost still.